A reckless daughter-in-law, exhausted from living under the same roof and caring for her elderly mother-in-law, decides to push her down the stairs, pretending it was an accident. However, something unexpected happens. After the death of her husband, Susan's life changed drastically. Once accustomed to an active and independent routine, she found herself facing the silence of an empty house and a lack of company, which soon began to affect her health. Over time, mobility issues and illnesses made her more dependent, limiting her daily activities. Concerned about her situation, her only son, Brandon, decided to bring her to live in his home in an attempt to provide more comfort and attention. Susan agreed to the move, relieved to leave behind the loneliness, but also apprehensive about becoming a burden. At first, the living arrangements were peaceful, and Susan made an effort to help with simple tasks, despite her limitations. However, her health deteriorated quickly, and she soon became completely dependent on Emily, her daughter-in-law, who was already handling all the household responsibilities. Emily also took on the role of caregiver, helping Susan with delicate tasks such as eating, bathing, and attending to her basic needs, while Brandon spent his days working to support the household. The day started like every other day in Brandon and Emily's house. The soft sound of the alarm echoed through the room, and Emily, still heavy-eyed with sleep, got up with a sigh. She headed to the kitchen and began preparing breakfast. As the aroma of fresh coffee spread throughout the house, Brandon appeared at the door, already dressed for work. "Good morning," he said, rubbing his face in an effort to wake up. "Good morning," Emily replied with a small smile, placing the coffee on the table. "It's almost ready." Brandon sat at the table and grabbed a piece of bread. "Did you sleep well?" "More or less," she answered, absent-mindedly stirring the sugar. "Susan woke up in the middle of the night asking for water." "I didn't hear her," said Brandon, taking a sip of his coffee. "Thanks for taking care of her." Emily shrugged and smiled faintly. "It's what I do every day, right?" After a few minutes of talking about Brandon's work and his expectations for the day, Emily stood up and began clearing the dishes. "It's time to wake Susan up for her medication and breakfast," she said, wiping her hands. Brandon looked at her, still holding his cup. "Thanks for everything, Emily. I know it's not easy taking care of her." She nodded. "I do what I can." He stood up, grabbed his briefcase, and kissed her on the forehead. "I'll be back later. See you soon." "See you," she replied as he walked out the door. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for another day. She went upstairs and slowly opened the door to Susan's room. "Good morning, Susan," she said gently. "Time to wake up." Susan opened her eyes slowly and responded with a tired murmur. "Is it time already?" "Yes, let's go. We need to take your medication and have breakfast." Emily moved closer to the bed and helped Susan sit up. With patience, she adjusted the pillows and handed her a glass of water and the pills. "I always forget how many medications I take now," Susan said, her tone almost apologetic. "These 3 in the morning. Nothing more," Emily responded firmly, watching her mother-in-law swallow the pills. After the medication, Emily helped Susan get up. "Let's take a quick shower before breakfast," she said. She carefully guided her mother-in-law to the bathroom, where the daily process began. She turned on the shower, adjusted the temperature, and helped Susan take off her nightgown. "You shouldn't have to do this for me," Susan said with a resigned sigh. "Don't worry, it's part of the routine," Emily responded as she helped her into the water. "Let's hurry up so we can go downstairs." After the shower, Emily dried Susan off and picked out a simple dress for her to wear. "There, you look great," she said as she put on Susan's shoes. Together, they carefully walked down the stairs to the kitchen, where Susan sat for breakfast. Emily prepared the toast and tea with the precision of someone who had repeated this routine countless times. Over the months, however, the routine began to take its toll on Emily. The constant care, the baths, the meals, and the medications occupied most of her day, leaving little time for herself. It felt as though the burden gradually increased, with no end in sight. One night, after helping Susan into bed, Emily went to the living room, where she found Brandon sitting on the couch with his laptop on his lap, typing something quickly. She paused at the doorway, watching him for a moment before deciding to speak. "Brandon, can we talk?" Emily said, moving toward the couch where he sat, the laptop still on his lap. Brandon looked at her, surprised by the interruption. "Of course, Emily. What's wrong?" he asked, closing the laptop and placing it on the coffee table. He adjusted himself on the couch, showing attentiveness. Emily sat next to him, letting out a tired sigh. She ran her hands through her hair as if trying to organize her thoughts before speaking. I'm really tired, Brandon." "Tired?" he repeated, leaning toward her slightly. "Of what? Did something happen today?" "It's not just today," Emily replied, looking at him. "It's every day. Brandon, I do everything for your mom. Since she came here, my routine has become something I can barely handle." He furrowed his brow, clearly confused. "But you've always been so dedicated. I thought you were managing." "Managing?" Emily asked, her tone a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. "I wake up every day to make the coffee, give her medication, help her bathe, dress her, walk her downstairs, make meals. And then I do it all over again at night. There's no time left for me." Brandon scratched his head uncomfortably. "Well, I know it's hard work, but what more can I do? I have to work to support the house. That's why I'm gone all day." "I understand you work," Emily said, raising her voice a little but without being aggressive. "But don't you think this is your responsibility too? You're the one who decided to bring your mom here. I thought this would be something we did together, not something that's all on me." Brandon leaned back on the couch, letting out a heavy sigh. "I don't know what to say, Emily. I'm doing what I can to make sure she has a roof, food, and comfort. You're here to help while I do that." "While you do that?" she repeated, crossing her arms. "Brandon, do you think it's fair that I do everything alone? That all the responsibilities, from the house to your mom, are on me?" "I didn't say it's fair," he responded defensively. "But I really don't know what you want me to do. When I get home, I'm exhausted. My job takes a lot out of me and—" Emily interrupted, her voice firm but not shouting. "And mine doesn't? Do you think I'm not exhausted? The difference is, I have no choice. I can't ignore your mum. She needs help with every little thing, and it all falls on me every day." Brandon looked away, pressing his lips together. He didn't respond immediately, but the expression on his face showed that Emily's words had affected him. "Brandon, I'm not saying you have to do everything," Emily continued, her tone calmer now. "But I need you to help me. Just a little. It could be something simple, like giving her the medication in the morning or helping her go to bed. If not, I'm going to break down." He stayed silent for a few more seconds before letting out a deep sigh and shaking his head. "Okay, you're right. I should help more. I didn't realize how much this was affecting you." Emily relaxed slightly, although her shoulders still carried the weight of accumulated exhaustion. "Thank you, Brandon. Really." "I'm sorry," he said, taking her hand. "I didn't want you to feel like you're doing this alone. I'll try to be more present and help with what I can." "That's all I want," she replied, squeezing his hand back. "For us to do this together." He nodded, and with a hesitant gesture, pulled her into an embrace. "I promise I'll try harder. We'll make things better." Emily returned the hug, closing her eyes for a moment. When they pulled apart, both seemed visibly relieved, though aware that the path ahead would still be challenging. The following days brought few changes to Emily and Brandon's routine. Susan, over time, became even more dependent. Moving on her own was nearly impossible, and even the most basic tasks like eating or dressing required Emily's constant presence. Although Brandon had promised to share the responsibilities, his help was sporadic, almost symbolic. He gave Susan her medication occasionally or took her to bed on rare occasions, but most of the time, the tasks once again fell to Emily. Each day felt like an endless cycle, and over time, Emily began to feel something that terrified her: anger, not just toward Brandon, but toward Susan. She knew it was irrational, but she couldn't help it. Every time she had to carry her mother-in-law, bathe her, prepare her food, or help her sit up, she felt a growing weight on her chest. "Can you at least try eating on your own, Susan?" Emily said one morning, holding the spoon for her mother-in-law. "I'm trying," Susan replied weakly and resignedly. "My hands shake too much." "You don't even try properly," Emily muttered impatiently before continuing to feed her. When she finished, she felt guilty for her harsh tone, but the irritation lingered. Little by little, this feeling grew. Emily began to hate her routine. She hated waking up early to care for Susan, hated how her time was consumed by someone who seemed so distant, and most of all, she hated feeling like her life had come to a standstill. The dreams she once had, perhaps of having children or dedicating herself to something of her own, seemed like a distant memory. One afternoon, after a long argument with Brandon about his lack of help, Emily locked herself in the bathroom to cry. "I can't take this anymore," she murmured to herself. "This isn't life." The next day, Emily woke early, made breakfast, and prepared Susan's medication. Brandon, as usual, rushed out to work after eating, leaving a quick "thanks for everything" in the air, which Emily didn't respond to. After bathing Susan and helping her dress, Emily felt like the weight of that day was heavier than usual. She was more tired than normal, and the repetitive routine felt suffocating. That afternoon, as she helped Susan up the stairs to rest in her room, something inside Emily snapped. Each step they climbed felt like tons of weight, not just from the physical effort, but from the years of frustration and resentment that had built up. "Slow down, Emily," Susan said, gripping the handrail. "I can't go fast." "I know you can't," Emily replied, impatient. Her voice was harsher than she intended, but she didn't correct herself. When they reached the middle of the stairs, Susan hesitated. "I need to stop for a moment," she said, breathing heavily. Emily stopped, but the sound of Susan's labored breathing was deafening. Suddenly she felt as if the weight of her entire life was right there on those stairs. For a moment, her vision blurred, and her thoughts became muddled. "Can't you just keep going?" Emily said, her voice full of exhaustion. "I'm trying, Emily," Susan replied, gripping the handrail more tightly. "I just need a moment." That was when Emily acted without thinking, driven by a mix of anger and desperation. With a firm shove, she released Susan from the handrail. The frail body of the elderly woman lost its balance, tumbling backward and rolling down the stairs to the floor below. The sound of the impact echoed through the house, followed by an eerie silence that seemed endless. Emily remained still for a moment, as if time had stopped. When she finally ran down the stairs, she found Susan lying on the floor, completely motionless. The elderly woman's face was pale, and her eyes were closed. She was unconscious. "Susan," Emily called, kneeling beside her. She touched her mother-in-law's shoulder with trembling hands, but there was no response. "Oh my God, Susan! Wake up, please!" She began shaking her lightly, her voice trembling with a panic that was carefully staged. She heard quick footsteps from upstairs. Within seconds, Brandon rushed down the stairs, still barefoot, his face full of concern. "Emily, what happened?" he shouted, rushing to kneel next to his mother's body. She fell," Emily said, her voice choked with sobs. "I was helping her up the stairs, and she tripped. It all happened so fast I couldn't hold on to her." Brandon looked at his mother, trying to process what he was seeing. "Fell? What do you mean fell, Emily? Why didn't you hold on to her?" He raised his voice, overwhelmed with panic and frustration. "I tried," Emily replied, now crying convincingly. She let go of the handrail suddenly, Brandon. I did my best. Oh my God. Brandon ran his hands through his hair, visibly in shock. He grabbed his cell phone and dialed for emergency help with trembling hands. I need an ambulance. My mother fell down the stairs. She's unconscious. Please come quickly, he said, his tone frantic. As Brandon spoke on the phone, Emily sat on the floor, covering her face with her hands. Tears streamed down her face, but her mind was in turmoil. What had she done? Would anyone believe her? She glanced at Brandon, who was now next to his mother, trying to see if she was still breathing. Mom, hang on, please, he pleaded, holding Susan's hand. Don't leave me, yet not now. She was so fragile, Emily murmured, still sitting on the floor. I swear I did everything I could. Brandon turned to her, his eyes filled with anger and desperation. You should have held on to her. How could this happen, Emily? How did she just fall like that? I don't know, Emily replied, her voice choked. I already told you. It all happened so fast. I'm in shock too, Brandon. The ambulance siren began to wail in the distance, and Brandon rushed to open the door for the paramedics. They entered quickly and knelt next to Susan, checking her vital signs. She's breathing, but she's unconscious, one of the paramedics said. We need to take her now. She'll be okay, won't she? Brandon asked, his voice trembling. We'll do our best, the paramedic responded as they placed Susan on the stretcher. Emily stood by the stairs, her eyes still full of tears as she watched Brandon follow his mother to the ambulance. He turned to her before leaving. Stay here, he said, his voice stern. I'm going with her. Emily nodded, without saying a word. When the door closed behind him, she finally exhaled. The weight of what she had done felt even heavier. The ambulance sped through the city streets, and Brandon, sitting beside his mother's stretcher, held her hand tightly. Susan was still unconscious, but at some point, between the bumps of the vehicle and the rhythmic sounds of the medical equipment, her eyes slowly opened. Mom! Mom! You're awake! Brandon exclaimed, leaning closer. Are you okay? Talk to me, please! Susan tried to speak, but her voice came out weak, barely audible. Brandon leaned in closer, eager to hear. It was Emily, Susan whispered, each word a struggle. She pushed me. Brandon froze. What are you saying, Mom? How can that be, Emily? This doesn't make sense. She was tired. I saw it in her eyes, Susan continued, struggling. She couldn't take it anymore. No, that can't be, Brandon whispered, tightening his grip on his mother's hand. You're confused. It was an accident. Just an accident. Susan tried to continue, but her voice grew even weaker, until it became inaudible. Her eyes began to close again, and the monitors started emitting loud, continuous alarms. Sir, we need you to step back, one of the paramedics said firmly as he prepared to begin resuscitation. Brandon was forced to let go of his mother's hand and step back, watching in horror as they tried to save her. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Brandon felt a tightness in his chest, the weight of helplessness mixing with the words his mother had spoken. They echoed in his mind like a terrifying whisper. She pushed me. Finally, one of the doctors turned to him with a grave expression. I'm sorry, sir. We did everything we could, but she didn't make it. The reality hit him like a punch. Brandon covered his face with his hands, stifling a cry of anguish. His mother was dead. And those words. How could he deal with that now? Emily wouldn't do this, would she? A few hours later, Brandon arrived home. The house was quiet, except for the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. Emily was waiting in the living room, sitting on the couch with her hands folded in her lap. When she saw Brandon enter, she immediately noticed something had happened. Brandon, she started, standing up. How is she? Is Susan okay? He stopped at the doorway, his eyes red and his face drained. She didn't make it, he said, his voice trembling. My mum died, Emily. Emily put her hand to her mouth, feigning shock that seemed rehearsed. Oh my God, Brandon, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. Brandon watched her in silence for a few seconds before finally breaking the barrier between them. She told me something before she died. Emily froze. What did she say? She said you pushed her, he replied, each word laden with a mix of anger and disbelief. That it wasn't an accident. That's absurd, Emily exclaimed, raising her hands in a defensive gesture. She was confused, Brandon. You know she could barely talk or think right in the last few days. She tripped. It was an accident, I've said that. Are you telling me my mother lied in her last moments? Brandon stepped forward, his eyes fixed on hers. I'm saying she wasn't lucid, Emily answered, almost shouting now. Do you really think I would do something like that, Brandon? After everything I've done for her, after years of caring for her, dedicating my life to it? I don't know what to think anymore, he said, shaking his head. I need some time. Brandon left the room without looking back and went out to the garden. He sat in a chair, his hands clutching his head. The cold night air brought no relief. His mind was in chaos. He remained there for hours until dawn arrived, bringing an even deeper silence. As he stared at the dark sky, something came to mind. The cameras. The security cameras. He had installed some recently, mainly for precaution, but rarely checked the footage. Maybe there was something there. Brandon entered the house quietly, passing the living room where Emily slept on the couch. He went to the office, turned on the computer, and accessed the camera system. The footage of the stairs was there. His heart raced as he began reviewing the moments from that day. The seconds dragged on as he watched. And then he saw it. The push. There was no denying it. Emily was behind Susan, and without hesitation, she had let go of the handrail and pushed his mother down the stairs. Brandon stopped the video and stared at the screen, stunned. The anger grew within him like a wave, drowning out any other thought, but at the same time, Brandon felt a hesitation wash over him. He stared at the screen, where the frozen image showed the exact moment Emily had let Susan go, allowing her to fall. The shock of confirmation was devastating. Why did she do it? How could someone who promised to care for my mother? He couldn't finish the thought. Brandon ran his hands over his face, trying to organize his feelings. There was sadness, anger, disbelief, and something he didn't want to admit, doubt. Should he report her? That would mean destroying her life, their marriage, everything they had built together. But what she did, she killed my mother. That phrase echoed in his mind like a mantra, pulling him back to the video every time he tried to justify his hesitation. He stood up, pacing the office. What if she denies it? What if she tries to justify herself? She'll say it was an accident, that she was tired. But the video doesn't lie. He clenched his fists, feeling a mix of determination and overwhelming weight in his chest. Finally, he stopped in front of the door. I can't let this go. My mom deserves justice, he murmured to himself, grabbing the phone with the video and the car keys. Brandon drove to the police station in the silence of the early morning. Every mile seemed longer than the last, and his mind wavered between certainty and guilt. When he arrived, he parked and sat in the car for a few minutes, looking at the illuminated facade of the station. He took a deep breath, trying to find strength for what he was about to do. If I don't do this, who will? Finally, he entered the station. The place was quiet, with only a few officers working the night shift. Brandon walked up to the counter, where a weary officer looked up at him. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" the officer asked. Brandon hesitated for a moment, but then extended his phone. "My wife, she killed my mother. I have a video that proves it." The officer furrowed his brow, immediately focusing. "Please, come with me," he said, indicating a small room nearby. Brandon followed him, sitting down in a chair while the officer connected the phone to a monitor to watch the video. "Can you explain further, sir?" the officer asked while setting up the equipment. "My mom lived with me and my wife," Brandon began, his voice shaking a bit. "She was sick, dependent. Today, my mom fell down the stairs and died. But before that, she told me my wife pushed her. I didn't want to believe it, but I checked the security cameras." He gestured to the phone. "It's all there." The officer hit play on the video and watched in silence. Brandon kept his eyes on the screen, though each second felt like a knife in his chest. When the moment of the push came, the officer paused the video, looking at Brandon. "This is very serious, sir," the officer said with a grave expression. "Are you sure you want to proceed with the accusation? We need to confirm this formally." Brandon took a deep breath, his eyes welling up. "I'm sure. She needs to be held accountable. This is my mother. I can't let this go." The officer nodded. "Very well. Let's file the case now. We'll also need you to sign a formal statement and send us all the security footage." Brandon agreed and spent the next hour providing all the details of the incident. With every word, he felt the weight of the situation increase. At the end, the officer stood up. "We'll contact the team to bring in your wife. This might take a few hours. Would you prefer to go home or wait here?" "I'll go home," Brandon replied, exhausted. "I want to be there when they take her." By morning, when Emily was awakened by knocks at the door, her confusion quickly turned to panic as she saw two uniformed police officers standing in the doorway. Brandon was standing behind them, arms crossed, his face a mixture of coldness and disappointment. "Ms. Emily," one of the officers began in a firm tone, "you are under arrest for homicide. We have evidence justifying your immediate detention. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." "What?" Emily exclaimed, stepping back. "This is a mistake. Brandon, what's going on?" "You know exactly what's going on," Brandon replied, his voice harsh. "I saw the video, Emily. I saw you push my mother down the stairs." "No! Brandon, please, you can't believe this. It was an accident. I would never do something like this on purpose," she screamed as the officers handcuffed her. "I saw it, Emily," he repeated, looking her straight in the eyes. "I saw it with my own eyes." "Don't bother lying." Emily started crying, her voice loud and desperate. "You can't do this to me, Brandon. I'm your wife. I did everything for you, for your mom, for this house." "You killed my mom," he said with a chilling calm, "and now you'll pay for it." As the officers led her to the car, Emily continued shouting, pleading for a chance to explain. Brandon stood at the door, watching the car leave. When the silence finally returned, he felt a bitter mix of relief and sadness. His mother was dead, his wife would be judged, and his life would never be the same. But deep down, he knew he had done what was right. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.